let's talk about system overview. So, before we dive into the deep nuts and bolts of our control logic architecture, just want to talk about how the system communicates with itself and the outside world, and talk about some of the different sensors and actuators that are inside of our cell. So, this diagram depicts the overall system communication. You can see there's some dashed boxes that separate the different areas of the cage, if you will, into kind of electrical panels. So these panel designations are actually seen inside of our electrical design schematics as well. So you'll see some commonality there, but um, you'll see that within the main panel we have an industrial PC. That's really the primary controller for the entire work cell. We also have a dumb switch, which connects several devices both inside and outside of that main panel. And then we have a pills safety controller in there as well. On the outside of the machine, directly on the side, we have a valve bank panel, which has a PoE switch and a valve bank device. It's a Ethernet IP adapter device indicated here in blue. Additionally, in the field, we've got a FANUC 0i CNC controller communicating over Ethernet IP. It's got an Ethernet IP adapter. Our industrial PC acts as an Ethernet IP scanner. Um, we also have a camera out in the field. It's actually has a direct Ethernet drop, and that Ethernet connection goes to VLAN 8. So any communication to the camera has to happen over VLAN 8. The Doosan has a separate connection, Ethernet connection to VLAN 8. Currently, it's not being used by our system, but will likely be used by a SCADA system um, or the WinJet system. And then we have the HMI, which is it's not an Ethernet device, but it's connected to our industrial PC over HDMI. And since it's a touch screen, it has some touchscreen outputs that we use through USB, which connects back to the industrial PC. And then out here, directly below the main panel, we have our robot controller, again as an Ethernet IP adapter, and it directly communicates with the FANUC robot. So yeah, effectively you can see any of the devices here that are on VLAN 8 are in orange. Ethernet IP, the local machine network is indicated in blue. Currently we don't have any PoE devices. And then this other just indicates the communication, some odd communication or non-Ethernet communication. So one thing to note is on the industrial PC, it has two Ethernet cards. The LAN 1 card on the Ethernet on the IPC is configured to communicate with the local machine network, which is a 192.168.0 subnet, and then its LAN 2 Ethernet card is configured to communicate to VLAN 8, and it does so on the 10.5.8 subnet. Um, so mostly for our cage control, the industrial PC is communicating with all the peripheral devices over the local machine network, and specifically on a protocol called Ethernet IP. The only exception to this rule is that our firmware does actually send commands to the camera to control the camera position and have it track the robot's movements. And so we actually communicate with the camera over VLAN 8 for that. Otherwise, everything is communicating over this local machine network and typically as an Ethernet IP adapter. So this just kind of diagrams the overall picture for sensors and actuators inside of our robot cell, or what it's responsible for. Inside the main panel, we um, we have some safety contactors, and those contactors are controlled by this PILS IO um, device. So it's basically like a PLC, but it's a safety controller. And you can see here I have all the different sort of safety, or sorry, IO devices that are present in the system, and I've designated them with color coding. So the big IO collector for our external devices is our valve bank IO. Our valve bank has digital inputs, outputs, and valves. So aside from the safety devices inside the main panel, on the outside of the panel, on the air prep panel, we have a lubricator switch which monitors the lubrication for our deburr tool. We also have some monitored states of our safety dump valves for the fence circuit and for the e-stop circuit. And then we also have monitored supply pressure. In the field, we have a deburr output, which is actually its own standalone valve. The standalone valve itself is driven by the valve bank output, but the valve itself is it's a standalone valve. The CNC fourth axis controls are controlled by the valve bank IO. You have two tailstock outputs. You have two tailstock or two collet outputs, and then we have actually four tailstock inputs to detect the clamped and unclamped states for the tailstock. Got a washer output. It's basically two outputs for the air dryers, stack lights, and the CNC door and its associated inputs. The robot end effector IO actually collects onto the R30IB controller through the EE connector. So all of these outputs and inputs are controlled by the robot controller itself. We're able to detect the states of those sensors and outputs via Ethernet IP back onto the PLC controller, but the robot controller itself is controlling, detecting these outputs and inputs. So that concludes our system overview.